Okay, how's that? Can you see the slides? Great,
Yeah.
thank you. Okay, thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to be here. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to an international audience. I'm going to be sharing with you stories from research that my group has been doing over the last 15 years or so. And I'm going to focus today on three environments. First, I'm going to be talking about agricultural systems. Second, I'll tell you a little bit about some work we did in the Arctic. And last, I'll finish up with some recent work we've been doing in the Greater Toronto area. So I want to start off by acknowledging past and present group members. So I'm only going to be sharing research done by some previous and current members of the team, but certainly it's the work of the team through the years in general that has helped put us in a position where we can make the kind of measurements that I'm going to be sharing with you today. And we've also received funding from provincial and federal sources in Canada, and also some support from the US NOAA organization. So I just want to briefly motivate the work that we do by reminding you that nitrogen is an element of the Earth system that has been dramatically perturbed by human activity. So if we take this framework of planetary boundaries, which are intended to represent a safe operating space for societal development in the context of the Earth system, we know that nitrogen has been dramatically altered. The biogeochemical flow of nitrogen has been dramatically altered. That's intentionally in order to feed the planet. But at the same time, we're now cycling so much nitrogen through the Earth system at such an unprecedented rate that it's posing problems or risks. And so, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk to you today about our studies of the surface atmosphere exchange of ammonia. So ammonia is one of the most important pieces of the reactive nitrogen puzzle on the planet. We're intentionally producing it synthetically in order to feed the planet, but a lot of it is leaking out into the Earth system. So if all that nitrogen went into our crops and into our animal protein, then that would be fine, but it doesn't all stay where we want it to go. It ends up in other parts of the environment. And so a lot of the work in my group has been to study where it's going and why it moves the way it does. So just to orient folks, this is a general sort of budget for the global atmospheric ammonia emissions. And so you can see that losses during fertilizer application and emissions from manure dominate the current atmospheric budget as we understand it. There are also contributions from fossil fuels and waste, so another sort of anthropogenic piece of the puzzle. And then there are also contributions from wildfire and other natural sources like the oceans and soil. So altogether, most budgets come up with a number on the order of 60 teragrams of nitrogen per year. So what happens when that ammonia goes into the atmosphere? Mostly it forms particle phase ammonium, or that's its main fate. And that drives a lot of the interest because we know that particulate matter is very important from an air quality and climate perspective. And ammonium is key in regulating the formation of particulate matter and also the pH of aerosol, which has implications for acidity and for reactions in multi-phase systems. A very small amount of ammonia is oxidized in the atmosphere, but I wanted to point out that we published a recent study looking at the fate of ammonia that's oxidized in the atmosphere, and something between 10 and 100% of it makes N2O. And so as we start to mitigate direct N2O emissions into the atmosphere, currently ammonia oxidation represents about 6% of the N2O budget, but it could become a relatively larger proportion if we mitigate direct N2O sources. The most common fate of ammonia is actually to deposit by a dry or wet deposition, either mostly in the gas phase or through the particle phase. And so when we're studying emissions and deposition, we really have to think about these as a coupled system. So the bidirectional flux framework has been around for a few decades as a way of conceptualizing what ammonia does in the environment. So you can imagine we have gas phase ammonia in the atmosphere. If we have some aqueous or condensed phase surface, then the ammonium ion will be in equilibrium with dissolved aqueous neutral ammonia regulated by the acid dissociation constant. And so the term emission potential, which we use the letter or symbol gamma for, it is related to the ratio of the ammonium ion to the H+ ion, because that dictates the amount of neutral ammonia that's present. That neutral ammonia, based on its Henry's law constant, will have a vapor pressure or an equilibrium gas phase concentration. And we can basically take the Henry's law constant and acid dissociation constant and their temperature dependences and express the equilibrium gas phase amount that would be present if the system was able to equilibrate. Now, in the real atmosphere, the actual concentration may be different. And so in principle, the concentration should tend towards the equilibrium amount set by the surface below. But there's some mass transfer resistance to that, denoted by an exchange velocity. And so there's a flux between the surface and atmosphere that's driven by the difference between the compensation point and the actual ammonia concentration, and the rate at which it equilibrates is determined by this exchange velocity. So this is a framework that has been used for, I guess, decades now to understand the bidirectional exchange of ammonia over a wide number of surfaces in the environment. So the first story I want to tell you is about work we've done in agricultural regions. We know that agriculture is the main source of ammonia on a global scale. And if we look at this reference here, we see that when urea, a very commonly applied type of fertilizer, is used across the world, the losses of ammonia following urea application can be very substantial, on the order of tens of %. So that represents an important loss to the farmer in terms of they're adding that nitrogen to try and increase their crop yield, but the nitrogen is not all going into the crops. And it also represents a source of ammonia pollution to the environment. So we were interested in understanding more about this. If we look at systems more similar to the one we were going to study, so this is corn in North America. There were two papers that were published around the time we were doing our work, or a little bit before, and they showed that in the 3 weeks following fertilization, in these cases with a combination of urea and ammonium nitrate, the losses of nitrogen were more like 4 or 5%, so not so substantial. So we wanted to understand what was driving these losses and this variability in more detail. So we had the opportunity to collaborate with Elizabeth Patty at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. She has a very nice experimental farm setup. This is what the field looks like. So she has 2 flux towers at sites A and B, and the field is treated. Two portions of the field are treated with urea only, fertilized with urea only, and the portion in the middle also has inhibitors applied. Those are intended to inhibit the activity of the urease enzymes and nitrification, to see whether that has an impact on the nitrogen losses. So the design of this field is intended so that no matter what direction the wind is coming from, one tower measures one treatment and the other tower measures the other treatment. That works very well for fluxes that you can measure from both towers, which is fine for things like N2O and CO2. In our case, we learned after many, many years of trying to do ammonia flux measurements that your instrument has to be very close to where you're making your flux measurement. So this box here is actually a temperature controlled housing that our ammonia instrument was inside, and you can see we're as close as possible to putting our inlet as short as possible and close to the sonic anemometer. So we only have measurements from this tower here. So the first thing I want to show you is this time series. So these data were collected by postdoc Alex Moravec, and in the second season, Soumya Singh joined him. And so what I'm showing you are high time resolution temperature measurements, ammonia time series, and vertical wind time series, and all these data are collected at 10 Hertz. And what you can see is that, for example, in this period here where there were more updrafts, you can see that the ammonia concentration is a little bit higher, as is the temperature. So we have positive sensible heat fluxes and positive ammonia fluxes. So this was encouraging to see, and we can really only see this type of coherence by paying very careful attention to how we set up the instrumentation. And Alex did a lot of work to understand what needs to be done from a technical perspective in order to make eddy covariance flux measurements. So I'm just showing two figures from a paper that he published in Atmospheric Measurement Techniques. So what you see on this left-hand panel is what happens when we're measuring some ambient amount of ammonia, and then all of a sudden we switch a valve and overflow the inlet with compressed air. And so if the instrument had a perfectly fast time response, we would see just sort of a square wave, but instead we see a pretty fast response and then a sort of secondary slow response. Earlier work in the group by Raluca Ellis, in earlier work to characterize our inlets, we had this D factor, which was the proportion of the response that is slow, because the time responses here dictate how much of the flux we can measure. And so Alex worked up all this data, which showed that the proportion of the flux we measure depends on the proportion of the response that's fast versus slow, but also the wind speed, and generated a time varying correction factor on the order of 20 to 60%. So those correction factors have been applied to the data that I'll show you. So here are the fluxes measured during the 2017 growing season. So on the left-hand side, you can see the flux magnitude. So the positive values are emissions, the negative values are deposition. And you can see that we were able to measure for almost the entire growing season. So we were able to start measuring fluxes starting a couple of days after the urea was applied, and we were able to measure until just before harvest. And so what you can see is this is a system that has bidirectional flux for sure. We have this early period following the fertilizer application where we do see emissions. Then we had a cool wet period in June while the plants were just emerging from the soil, where we saw predominantly deposition. Then later in the summer, particularly in the warm, dry part of the summer, we saw emissions. And then later in the autumn, when the plants were starting to senesce, we saw a lot of deposition. But one of the really interesting things was that we mostly were focused on understanding the fate of the nitrogen applied during fertilization. And what we saw is something like less than 0.1% of the applied nitrogen was lost as ammonia, which was a lot smaller than we were expecting. So now I'm zooming in on this period here. So the green line denotes when the fertilizer was applied. Unfortunately, fieldwork being what it is, we weren't ready right on that day to be making good flux measurements, but we do have some relaxed eddy accumulation measurements that also showed the emissions weren't very large. And once we were starting to make flux measurements, we saw a day with high emissions and a few days after that with moderate emissions, but really nothing too substantial. So in 2018, we went back. We were prepared well in advance of fertilizer application to get some baseline measurements. Fertilizer was applied a little bit earlier in the season in mid-May. But what you can see is there were just moderate deposition, no emissions prior to fertilizer application. Fertilizer was applied, and we still really saw nothing in the way of emissions for a long time. If we zoom in a little bit here, you can see that it rained a few days after fertilizer was applied in 2018, and we do see a few days of emissions that have a sort of reasonable diurnal profile. So we are able to quantify very small emissions. It's just that they weren't happening. So that was pretty interesting. So we went back to 2017, where we saw, at least earlier on, some emissions. And so as I mentioned, these cumulative fluxes are really, really small. And if we think back to these papers from Walker and Nelson, they were seeing something on the order of a few percent. Now, what would that have looked like in our data? I would basically have to have a signal that's that high for that long to see something similar to them. So while we do have, this early period where we might have missed some important emissions, we aren't seeing anything like what other researchers have seen. And so that's an interesting difference. I'll come back to that. We did make periodic measurements of the soil ammonium content in the field, pre and post fertilizer application. There's a lot of heterogeneity in the field, so it's hard to get a very solid number for the emission potential. But if we put our emission potentials into a model and use that to predict the compensation point, and then with information from the field about exchange velocities, we would have predicted emissions on the order of something like 20 or 10 nanograms per meter squared per second. And we measured values that were smaller, but not dramatically smaller. So what we take from this is that while the emissions we observed were significantly smaller than past field studies, they're pretty much in alignment with what our understanding of the conditions on the ground were during that period. And so the fact that the soil was very cold, that the nitrogen was incorporated into the soil, and then it was added initially as urea, all of those probably contributed to the fact that the ammonium was being produced slowly in the soil and the conditions did not favor its release. So we also had this beautiful long time record over the entire growing season. And so Alex Moravec is working on an analysis to apply a 2-layer compensation point model for the developed canopy. So in this model, we're thinking about exchange between the atmosphere and the soil, but also between the atmosphere and the vegetation. So we know that ammonia can be exchanged with the plant through the stomata, and also that it can be lost to the cuticular surface of the plants. So we can look to the literature to get a prediction of the stomatal emission potential. We have some guidance from our soil measurements on the soil emission potential. As I said, that's from measurements. And so what was really exciting to see is that if we look again at our measurements of the flux in blue, when Alex used that two-point compensation model in the forward mode, he predicts the time series in red. And there are a lot of places where that prediction looks an awful lot like what we see in the field. So there are aspects of the model that seem to explain our observations very well. There is this period in the middle where the model suggests that we should have seen significant emissions, but the measurements don't reflect that. When Alex takes his model and partitions the fluxes between the ground, the stomata, and the cuticles, you can see that in June, the dominant flux pathway is between the soil and the atmosphere, but as the canopy starts to grow and leaf out, it actually inhibits exchange between the soil and the atmosphere. And during this period where the model and measurements aren't matching well, we see that the stomata is dominating. So it seems that there's something incorrect about the way that the model is assigning stomatal fluxes, but that seems to work okay later in the season. Yeah, here's a cartoon of what the canopy looks like during those periods. So the lessons we've learned from this work we did in the cornfields is that the emissions from ammonia can be small if the application buries the nitrogen below the soil, if the conversion of urea to ammonia is slow. So in order to make ammonia, urea has to be acted on by urease. This is different than the other corn studies in North America, where some of the nitrogen was applied directly as ammonium nitrate, so could immediately be lost. There's also this competing pathway for nitrification, so that could also be keeping the ammonia concentrations low. And then the soil temperature itself was very low. That should mitigate, or it would basically make the compensation point lower because these equilibria are very temperature dependent. And so both environmental factors and these management practices seem to allow a significant amount of nitrogen to be added in an agricultural context, and for its losses to the atmosphere, at least, to be very small. What we found, interestingly, is that actually the emissions of ammonia from this field were much larger later in the season. They seem to be moderated through the vegetation, but we've been struggling to understand the partitioning between the stomatal pathways and the cuticles. We think the cuticular exchange is actually probably also bidirectional, but we're having trouble partitioning it out. Okay, so I want to switch gears now and take you to the Arctic. So this is not typically a place where people think about ammonia in the atmosphere, but I'm going to try and show you that it might be important to the story of the Arctic atmosphere. So this is a view of the world centered at the North Pole. So here's Greenland and the Canadian Arctic, and I'm going to be talking to you about measurements that were made in this region. And so the blue line is showing you the position of the Arctic front in winter, which includes a lot of the northern hemisphere, populated northern hemisphere, which means that a lot of pollution sources a lot of pollution from the lower latitudes can make its way to the Arctic. And in the winter and spring, there tends to be this, I'm not sure you can make it out in this photograph, but this haze layer in the Arctic because of the long-range transport of anthropogenic pollution from lower latitudes. But in the summer, the Arctic front retreats poleward, and so this part of the Arctic becomes very isolated from the lower latitudes, and the atmosphere in the Arctic tends to be very clean in the summer. So if we look at ALERT and Zeppelin, two high latitude Arctic sites, in the winter and summer months, if we're looking at the number of particles as a function of diameter, we see lots of accumulation mode, larger particles arriving, we think, by long-range transport. But if we look at those same aerosol size distributions in the late spring and early summer, you can see that these smaller modes representing probably newly formed particles become dominant. So this is evidence that there's new particle formation in the high Arctic and summer months. Those new particles, if they grow large enough to be cloud condensation nuclei, can have a very big impact on the climate in the Arctic. And so we're really interested in understanding what's regulating the budget of aerosol in the high Arctic in the summer. So that was the motivation for the Net Care campaign, which was led by my colleague, John Abbott at the University of Toronto. And so here's a photograph of the Canadian high Arctic. You can see the ocean in the foreground. We have direct emissions of sea spray aerosol. We also have emissions of gases like dimethyl sulfide and volatile organic compounds. Those gases enter the atmosphere and they can be oxidized to form new particles, and then those particles can grow. And if they are cloud forming or cloud active, they're going to interact with solar radiation, as I mentioned, and have a big climate impact. But that's not the only possible source of particles in the Arctic. We can also have long-range transport. In particular, in the summer, anthropogenic low-latitude sources are less common, but unfortunately, boreal fires are becoming increasingly important. There's also, as the Arctic warms, increased shipping, local shipping, so there could be contributions from that. And so we want to understand how all these factors work together. So here's a photograph of the Arctic Ocean and this bidirectional flux framework, just to remind you that we can apply this framework in this environment as well. But we're going to think about how it might get coupled into emissions of DMS. So DMS is pretty insoluble. So it's basically going to evade the ocean, be oxidized in the atmosphere to form low volatility sulfur gases. Those gases can form new particles, but they will form new particles more quickly if there's ammonia present. So again, this is the bidirectional flux framework that we can use to understand how much ammonia might be present. So before heading to the Arctic, we looked to the literature to see what we might expect in terms of ammonia over the Arctic Ocean. And this paper by Martin Johnson brought together a series of measurements over the ocean, not just in the Arctic, but more broadly. In some regions, the ocean is a source, but the ocean can also be a sink. In this paper, they organized the fluxes. So the fluxes are on the y-axis as a function of latitude on the x-axis. And you can see that for the higher latitude cruises, they predominantly saw deposition. So the ocean becomes very cold, and there tends not to be a lot of nitrogen. And so those two factors conspire to mean that the ocean is a sink, mostly at high latitudes. At the same time, we were interested in the fact that Julia Schmala had published a paper in the Antarctic region showing that the particles that they measured had a decent amount of ammonium in them, indicating that there must be some ammonia in the air. And in the organic fraction of the particles, they also saw a lot of amino acids and amines, so other reduced nitrogen compounds. And those measurements were made in this part of the Southern Ocean in proximity to Bird Island. And Stuart Riddick had published a paper documenting the contribution of seabird colonies to ammonia emissions globally. So birds excrete their nitrogen in the form of uric acid. And as uric acid is mineralized, it can produce lots of ammonia. And so seabird colonies are relative to agriculture globally, not super important, but these emissions are happening in parts of the atmosphere with very few other sources. So since the lifetime of ammonia is only about a day against deposition, something can be very important locally, even if it doesn't matter globally. And so we were wondering what we were going to see in the Arctic. So we went to the Arctic in 2014 and 2016. We made measurements from the Amundsen icebreaker, and we also made measurements in 2016 at Alert, this high Arctic site operated by the Canadian government. So the measurements in 2014 were led by Greg Wentworth. This map shows you the route of the icebreaker. So it sailed north along the coast of Baffin Island. It went into Lancaster Sound and then came out again, passed by Greenland in the Nares Strait and back towards Tuktoyaktuk. The dots represent the position of the ship when an ammonia measurement was made, and the color tells you how much ammonia there was. So we were measuring regularly hundreds of parts per trillion of ammonia. We were using an automated ion chromatography instrument that could make measurements every hour. And we were regularly seeing quite high levels of ammonia, which was pretty interesting and surprising. So we were lucky to be able to collaborate with some oceanographers to collect water samples from the open ocean and also from melt ponds that we encountered in the sea ice. So we characterized the ammonium content, the pH, and the temperature. And then using those values, we were able to calculate a compensation point. So the open ocean compensation point was less than 25 parts per trillion, and the melt pond compensation point was less than 10 parts per trillion. These are substantially below the concentration we measured, which means that they can't be sources. They have to, basically, they're receiving deposition from the atmosphere. So we worked with Betty Croft, who was a research associate in Randall Martin's group at Dalhousie University. She took the map of colonies from Stuart Riddick's work, and we supplemented it with a few additional colonies that we found in various data sources. So this is what the map of the circumpolar northern, Arctic colonies look like, colored by the amount of ammonia that they emit. And we force the ammonia to be emitted only in the summer months, which is when the birds are present. And when Betty put this source into her model, she was able to see that that had an enormous impact on the concentration of ammonia in the atmosphere, particularly in the region around Greenland. So we just happened to be sailing in this part of the atmosphere, this part of the world where the seabird colonies had a very dramatic impact exactly at the time we were there. So the presence of the seabirds increased the ammonia concentration by, several factors, basically. So that was really interesting to see. It was exciting to other folks on the team who were trying to understand the budget of new particles because, as I mentioned to you, there are these observations of new particle formation events. So let me explain this figure a little bit better. So this is the aerosol number concentration. This is time. So May, June, July, August, September, October. This is in 2011. The particles, these small particles that were observed or measured are in black. And you can see that when the geochem model was run without ammonia from the seabird colonies, you get the red line. So basically, the model is never able to simulate new particle formation events without seabird ammonia. When Betty implemented the seabird emissions into her model, then the new particle aerosol number concentrations are the blue. So they're not matching perfectly, but these are pretty complicated processes to match in time. However, we just see that behavior. We see the fact that new particles can form in the model with the ammonia from the birds. So that suggests that the birds, certainly the new particle formation is very sensitive to ammonia, and the birds are providing, in the model at least, enough ammonia to make new particles. So this is a photograph of alert. We went back. Let me finish off my thought here. So Betty could use the model. We knew in the model that more new particles were formed. Those particles were able to grow large enough to make cloud droplets. So this is the map showing the change in cloud droplet number. So in the same place where birds were important for ammonia, they also had a pretty dramatic change in the cloud droplet number, like up to 50%. And the aerosol indirect effect, of course, is dependent on clouds. And so the presence of these additional cloud droplets also led to a cooling of, right in the heart of this, up to 2 watts per meter squared cooling. So potentially these birds could have a pretty significant climate impact. But we also knew that 2014 was a period that was really dominated by a lot of fires. So what I'm showing you in these 2 panels are basically the location of boreal fires in 2014. And then in pink is the location of the seabird colonies. So during some parts of the cruise, when we did back trajectories, we found the air was strongly influenced by the birds, but during other periods, so here's the location of the ship during this period, the air was mostly coming from areas impacted by fires. So the birds weren't necessarily the only explanation for what was going on. So we wanted to go back and learn more. So in 2016, Alex Moravec took the instrument that he had used. He subsequently used for the agricultural fluxes. He took that on the back. He brought that onto the ship. So same kind of map I showed you before, the ship tracks colored by the ammonia concentration. And you can see that the details are different. We saw longer periods with low concentrations, but we did occasionally see elevated hundreds of parts per trillion ammonia from the ship. In particular, when the ship was in close proximity to bird sanctuaries, here's a time series going up to 6 parts per billion or 6,000 parts per trillion. And you can see that the ambient concentrations were, would be really, really high when we were in close proximity to the birds. So they can certainly be an important source. In 2016, Greg took the IC system to alert, and he collected this time series of atmospheric ammonia. So again, in the hundreds of parts per trillion. And he also collected some soil samples during that campaign. And so he measured the temperature of the soil continuously, and then he collected a few different soil samples so that we could calculate the emission potential. And then using that temperature, we could predict the compensation point. And so when he takes those 3 different emission potentials, which varied by a factor of about 20. At least for the two highest emission potentials, you can see that the compensation point in two cases is higher than the atmospheric concentration. So this would suggest that at least some portion of the soil is able to act as a source of ammonia to the atmosphere. So if we bring together the three atmospheric observation data sets we have from the Arctic, we have measurements from the ship in 2014, from the ship in 2016, and from the ALERT ground station in 2016. And you can see that they have pretty similar distributions, medians on the order of 100 to 200 parts per trillion. And so while the birds and the fires can be periodically and in some places very important sources, it seems like there's pretty consistently on the order of, tens to hundreds of ppt of ammonia in the Arctic. And just to put this in context, in 2014, it was an extremely high fire summer, whereas in 2016, it was one of the lightest fire summers for the boreal north, at least over Canada. And, they're still pretty similar. So fires are not, dominating everything, at least in the higher Arctic. So as the NetCare project drew to a close, Betty Croft did some final model simulations to see what was impacting the particle number over the Arctic. And what she found is that the baseline model prior to the NetCare campaign had a large low bias in particle numbers, but adding birds helped, and adding the tundra helped, and adding all of them together helped even more. So it seems like emissions from the tundra could be important, but we only collected 3 soil cores in one location. Obviously, the Arctic is a really vast environment, and so I think a lot more measurements need to be made in order to understand this properly. So to summarize what we learned about in the Canadian summertime Arctic, I didn't discuss this in detail, but particle phase ammonium loadings are very small, so most of the ammonia is present in the gas phase. Boreal fires can make episodic contributions. Seabird colonies can be important, especially locally. Over the ocean, there's typically net deposition. So it seems like bidirectional exchange over terrestrial ecosystems must also be important, but we need to understand it much better. Okay, so in the last part of the talk, I'm going to share some more recent work that we've been doing. And I want to bring you back to this bidirectional flux framework, which has underpinned so much of what we've done so far. There's one element that we haven't really addressed properly, and that's the fact that in a soil matrix, most of the mineral and organic content of the soil tends to be negatively charged on its surface. And that means that cations can become associated with soil, right? And we often characterize soils by their cation exchange capacity, which relates to how much negative charge is on the surface of the soil. So ammonium is a cation, and that means it's going to interact with soil particles, and some fraction of it can become adsorbed and strongly electrostatically bound to the soil. So in the work that we've done so far in my group, and work that others have done as well, when we want to characterize the emission potential of soil, we are going to measure the ammonium content of the soil, and we're going to measure the pH of the soil to determine the H+, and then we're going to combine those to estimate an emission potential. So the typical protocol that we've used to quantify the ammonium content of the soil is a sort of standard extraction technique that's pretty exhaustive. So you put a very salty, usually calcium or potassium chloride solution, you mix that with your soil, and that extracts all of the ammonium. It gives you the ammonium that was originally in the pore water in the neutral form or the protonated form, but it also, by adding so much calcium, you push all of the ammonium off of the soil. So that all the ammonium that's adsorbed in the original soil sample is something that you measure. And that's just following the regular protocol when that people follow when they want to know the total amount of ammonium in the soil. But what we really want, what's really relevant to the atmospheric equilibrium, is just the sum of the ammonia and ammonium that's present in the aqueous phase, because in the intact environment, the equilibrium is being established. This emission potential relates to what's in the aqueous phase. And so if these two things are different, then we're going to have a poor representation of the emission potential. And the punchline is that they are very different, because in most soils in their normal environments, most of the ammonium is actually adsorbed to the soil, not freely available in the pore water. And so that means that we're misrepresenting the emission potential. So this work was led by Matthew Davis, who's just wrapping up his PhD in my group. So following work done by others, including John Walker, we wanted to apply an isotherm model to estimate the amount of ammonium that's actually available in soils. And so these isotherm models, there's various flavors of them. The Langmuir model has been used extensively. Matthew carried out these experiments and then used different isotherm models to try and fit them. And I'll show you which one we liked best in the end. So what's happening here is we have 3 different soil samples with different cation exchange capacities. And we are exposing them to different amounts of aqueous ammonium in solution, very large amounts. And then we're determining how much ammonium is adsorbed. So these are in different units. So milligrams per liter in the solution, and milligrams per kilogram adsorbed. But what you can see is that as you increasingly add more ammonium into the solution, the more ammonium becomes adsorbed, but then it eventually saturates. But these are at enormously high, unrealistically high concentrations. We just use them to map out these relationships. So, and you can see that as the cation exchange capacity increases between soil samples, we are able to adsorb more. So what one can do with these isotherms is come up with a relationship between the amount of ammonium in the aqueous part of the soil, which is what we want. How does that depend on the total amount of ammonium in the soil and some other parameters? And so this paper is currently in discussion, so I'll just give you the highlights, which is to say we found the Temkin model did best. A nice thing about the Temkin model is this QT parameter can be physically linked to the cation exchange capacity. So if you know the cation exchange capacity of your soil, which people often do, then you can have a pretty good estimate of the QT. And then we came up with this other fitting parameter for this expression. So we had a training set where we determined these parameters, then we evaluated them with a test set, and they do a very good job of predicting the amount of aqueous ammonium available for exchange with the atmosphere. So if I calculate my emission potential using different approaches, I get very different emission potentials. So this is a bit of a busy slide, but what I'm showing you here is the emission potential varying over several orders of magnitude, organized by the cation exchange capacity. If we followed our typical protocol of extracting the ammonium with a very salty solution and measuring the pH in a deionized water slurry, we would come up with the red points, so the sort of higher band of emission potentials. If I use the Temkin isotherm approach that I just described, I get the triangles. And so you can see that those are very different. If we make both the ammonium and pH measurements using salty solutions, we get the yellow diamonds. If we make them both using deionized water, we get the lines. So you can see that the choices you make for how you extract these ions from the solution have a big impact. And under most conditions, the standard approach leads to an overestimate of basically a factor of 10 between the isotherm approach that we think is more correct. So what are the consequences of this for understanding ammonium in the environment? So Matthew applied this to understanding ammonia in Toronto. So the map in the right-hand corner is a land cover map of the urban Toronto area. There's a lot of green space in Toronto. Matthew and an undergrad, Kevin Yan, collected many soil samples across the city. And then they calculated the compensation point using either the standard approach, which gives us the brown envelope, or the Temkin approach, which gives us the green envelope. And during this period, Matthew was also measuring gas phase ammonia concentrations out the window of our building on campus, and he got the black line. And so remember, the flux is the difference between the compensation point and the ammonia concentration. So if now I'm on a linear scale, if I take the compensation point minus ammonia for those two versions, everything above the line is emissions. So basically, if we believed the emission potentials from the standard approach, that would suggest that soils in the city are an enormous source of ammonia constantly, even in the winter. Whereas if we take our more refined Temkin approach, we see that soils in Toronto can be a moderate source in the warmer months, but would not be a source in the spring or the fall or the winter. So the details of how we characterize our soil emission potentials can be quite important. So I know I'm running short on time, so I'm just going to wrap up with a quick story about another important surface that can act as a source of ammonia, and those are the Great Lakes. So this map here is the sort of southwestern Ontario. So here's Toronto here on Lake Ontario. This is Lake Erie with the cities of Cleveland and Detroit and Buffalo. And this project actually originated as something to do during the COVID lockdowns. Matthew looked up all of the lake chemistry data that was in this large archival data set and calculated the emission potential across the Great Lakes. And you can see that it's variable, but it's in the tens up to hundreds for the emission potential, which is not that different than the soils. And these lakes have absolutely massive surfaces. And this is a figure from Fabien Pelot's work looking at the ammonium emissions from the ocean. And if I take his color maps, which are different model representations of the ammonium content or emission potential, you can see the emission potentials range from blue is 10, red is 100. So we're sort of in the same ballpark as the ocean. So the Great Lakes are certainly smaller than the oceans, but they're pretty big and they're close to these populous cities. So maybe they could be important on a regional scale. So we worked with Mike Sitwell from Environment and Climate Change Canada. He incorporated our lake bidirectional exchange into their chemical transport model. So here's the domain of the model centered on the Great Lakes. The green values over land represent the land emissions in the base model simulation. So he ran the model once with only these terrestrial emissions, and then he imposed an emission potential of 200 over all freshwater surfaces as a sort of sensitivity test. That's right in the middle of the emission potentials that we derived from the database. And combining those with the surface temperature of the lakes, you get these emissions in the blue. So they're, the scales are quite different, but the regions are large. So the consequence of incorporating the bidirectional emissions from the lake relative to the base model that didn't have them was to increase the amount of ammonia in the atmosphere in proximity to the lakes by, up to tens of %. If we look more broadly, this is just the concentration, gas phase concentration in the surface atmosphere. So you can see that it's not the case that this leads to big emissions, net emissions of ammonia and hotspots over the lake. It's just that they're less low than they used to be. So this is the gas phase ammonia in the simulation with lake emissions. And this is the particle phase ammonium. And so the ammonia and ammonium are not higher over the lakes. They just aren't as low as they would be without this bidirectional exchange. So the baseline version of the model, the lake could only act as a sink, could only have deposition. We're just saying maybe it can have emission and deposition. So if we look at some cities along the lakeshore, like Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit, and Toronto, we see that on particular days in the summer, the ammonia in the gas phase can increase by, on average, it's only a few percent, but there are days where it increases by tens of percent. And this might be a lower estimate because Matthew did collect some water samples in close proximity to the shore. So this is the shoreline of Toronto. And so when we look at the samples in close proximity to the shore, we see that the emission potentials can be actually quite a bit higher. So potentially, depending on what kind of effluent is going into the lake in the nearshore region, there could be even higher emission potentials. So to sum up, I showed you some data from agricultural regions where management practices and environmental conditions were important. In the Arctic, we didn't find any emissions from the ocean or melt ponds, but fire, birds, tundra can all be important. And in urban areas, we found that bidirectional exchange can occur over lakes and soils. And so in general, we need more direct measurements of ammonia fluxes, and we also need to better characterize the emission potentials everywhere. So thanks very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions or hear from you by email.